Where do ghost stories come from? What can they tell us about the society and culture during the time that they're first told? Can ghost stories reveal our anxieties and subconscious biases? Ghost stories are a tale as old as time, with some of the earliest recorded ghost stories occurring in ancient Rome. Writer Pliny the Younger described a house haunted by a ghost that was, quote, in the form of an old man of extremely emaciated and squalid appearance, with a long beard and disheveled hair, rattling the chains of his feet and his hands, end quote. After that, the house remained vacant until philosopher Athenodorus rented it and sat up all night waiting to see this ghost. And finally it did. Athenodorus, according to Pliny, when confronted by the ghost, told the ghost, "Hey, I need a minute, I'm still praying. If you don't mind just chilling out for a sec." Eventually he gets back to the ghost that's just waiting for him, and it leads him out of the house, into the yard, and then vanishes. The next morning, Athenodorus dug up the spot where the ghost had disappeared and found the remains of a skeleton in chains. He gave the long-neglected corpse a proper burial, and the haunting ceased. Almost every culture has some version of ghosts, and even today, 45% of Americans say they believe in ghosts, and around 30% say they have witnessed them firsthand. Why have ghost stories stuck around in modern times? I mean, we've actually started using modern technology to communicate with ghosts and to try to prove their existence. What does all this say about our culture and society? And what does it say about past cultures? We'll be answering all these questions and more on today's episode. Hi, I'm Katie, and welcome to Yappin' About History, a podcast where we yap about the past so that the present makes more sense. And I thought it would be fun to do a little spooky history series for the month of October. I'd like to say that personally, I'm a bit of a scaredy cat when it comes to scary movies, but I like reading scary books and listening to scary podcasts. I just can't do it at night. And speaking of scary stories, I thought I'd start the episode by telling some of my own stories. While doing research for this episode, I've realized that I've been to some of the most haunted places in the United States. So here's what happened to me. Pretty much nothing. I would consider myself a skeptic that would be interested in seeing a ghost, or at least seeing proof with my own eyes, but alas, it has not happened to me yet. Some of the places I've been to are the Whaley House in Old Town, San Diego. This is supposed to be like one of the most haunted homes in America. It was built in the 1850s, and it was supposedly on the execution site of a man named James Yankee Jim Robinson, and he's now the one that haunts the place. But some people have said that they've seen members of the Whaley family walking around. I've also been to Salem, Massachusetts, and I didn't see anything spooky. For those who don't know, that's where the infamous witch trials happened in the late 1600s. We'll talk a little bit more about that in this episode. And I've also been to the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. I would say that was probably one of the more creepy places I've been, and it felt weird to walk around, and I've got like creepy looking pictures. There's not anything supernatural or paranormal. I have been to the Winchester house with some friends, and my friend swears that she felt a tap on her hard hat, because you have to wear hard hats on this tour. She said that she felt a tap when we were in the supposed seance room. That's kind of the closest I've been to. My mom and aunt said that they heard and saw weird things when they did the tour of the Queen Mary. So unfortunately, I don't have too many interesting, scary stories. So let's get into it. Grab your drink. I've got my drink here. I'm going to actually wait to tell you about it when we get to the story, because I don't want to spoil it. But cheers, and let's get spooky. So most of the episode is going to focus on the book that I read called Ghostland, An American History in Haunted Places by Colin Dickey. And there'll be a couple more sources that I'll list in the episode description. I'm mostly going to be talking about some specific examples and stories that Dickey talks about in his book that I think examine or help to answer some of the questions we asked earlier. Like, why do we tell ghost stories? Who tells them? Who gets left out? It's like in Hamilton, who lives, who dies, who tells your story, you know? So, like I said, we'll first start off with the Salem Witch Trials. We'll actually be covering the Scottish Witch Trials later on this month. In her book called In the Devil's Snare, historian Mary Beth Norton argues that one pressing fact lay behind the witchcraft trials and drove the hysteria. The judges and magistrates overseeing the trials were all military and civil leaders who had failed repeatedly to keep Essex County safe from Native American attacks during the King Philip's War and were unable to defeat Satan in the forests and garrisons of the northeastern frontier. They could nonetheless attempt to do so in the Salem courtroom. The witchcraft that might have begun with a group of teenage girls, but Norton argues that the town's leaders quickly seized on this outbreak as a means of exonerating themselves for past shortcomings. They were the ones on trial and they acquitted themselves. So basically, the people in charge kind of took it as a way to make themselves look better because they had failed miserably in protecting their constituents from natives, and so they felt like they were able to at least save their constituents from the devil. It also became pretty clear that some of the initial accusations could be tied to land disputes between neighbors. And after the witch trials were in full swing, the constable and some other of the elected officials began collecting all of the accused belongings, property, and land. So it's no wonder that the legend of Salem's ghosts are mixed with the cursed land and homes because they were gotten in a dirty and violent way, either by murdering the natives or falsely accusing neighbors of being witches. It also tells the story of scapegoating and gender roles. Women were ostracized, accused of being witches, and then murdered. And this was all because they were deemed too independent, or they were unmarried, or in any other way choosing to go against the gender norms in their society. And this is a recurring structure of a classic ghost story. After all, the ghost remains because it cannot believe the perverse normality of a world that has gone on living, that has forgotten whatever personal tragedy happened there. And this is particularly true of Salem. It has become a travel destination for all things witchy and occult. You should look up videos right now, actually, on social media of what it looks like now in October. It's jam-packed with witch-themed bachelorette parties, paranormal ghost tours, people wanting to be in one of the spookiest places in the country during the spookiest months of the year. Now, I'm not here to yuck anyone's yum, but all the hubbubaloo and touristy stuff is a stark contrast to the actual history. The most important being that Salem was never a witch town and there was no witches' covens there. In actuality, 20 innocent people were murdered via public execution, and hundreds more were accused and had their lives turned upside down because of mass hysteria, greed, and sexism. That being said, it is a really interesting place to visit, and the museums do a good job of telling the history of the town and the witch trials, and it's a very, very beautiful area. I'm not trying to discourage anyone from going, quite the opposite. I think the best way to learn about history is to actually be in those places. I would just say, just remember to dig a little deeper into the ghost and spooky stories to find out where they came from and ask yourself, why do we tell these stories? And this won't be the only time we see this kind of pattern in U.S. history in our other ghost stories that we tell. And speaking of, another such incident involves a woman named Sarah Winchester and the house that she built, which would become famous as the Winchester Mystery House. Now, when I read this story in the book, I was really surprised and shocked because I had no idea what the actual truth was. I've been to the Winchester house a couple times and have done the tour. And so I've only heard kind of the mysterious and creepy story about her. And I thought because it's the official house tour that it would be correct. But after reading this book, it seems like it's not the case. So let me tell you a little bit about it. First of all, if you don't know the story about the Winchester house, basically this woman in the mid to late 1800s, she marries a man who is part of the Winchester Repeating Rifle Company, and the Winchester rifle was known as the rifle that won the West. It was used in a lot of basically killing of Native Americans, and anytime a rifle was needed to kill someone, most likely during that time, it was a Winchester rifle. Her husband and infant daughter die, and she gets really upset about this. And so she goes to a psychic. The psychic tells her, you need to move into a new home, and you have to keep building on this home until you die, because all of the people who have died from a Winchester rifle, their spirits or their ghosts are trying to get you. And the only way that you can stop them from getting to you is by continuously building on this home so that it confuses the spirits. So she moves out to San Jose, California area. She buys this, it's a relatively nice home. And for the next however many years, there's construction nonstop, 24/7, 365. She has stairs that go up into the ceiling, doors that open up to the doors are on walls on like the second floor. So if you were to open and step outside, you'd fall. There's all these kind of like weird things like that. And that's all to confuse the ghosts. And she would have seances in her house, and you get to see that room. And like that room has 4 exits, but only 1 entrance, and all these crazy things in the house. This was all because she was so superstitious and paranoid about the ghosts from those killed by her husband's rifle company. So that's the story that is told. That's kind of the story that is famous about the Winchester Mystery House. But let me tell you about what actually happened. So pretty much the entire story and lore behind her haunted house is completely fabricated. Her only child died in infancy, and her husband died 15 years later. So there's, first of all, a big time discrepancy in her losses. And she was already living in California at this point with her husband before he died, and her 2 sisters and their families. Because part of the story is like, oh, she was this like widow who lived all alone and she had no family and blah, blah, blah. But she actually had quite a lot of family and extended family. The only thing that's kind of weird about her story that is factual is the doctor who was called to the house when she died in 1922 was named Dr. Euthanasia Mead. That's very, very strange name for a doctor. From the research, it seems like the craziest thing is that this lore about Sarah Winchester comes from one singular article written in the San Jose Daily News on Friday, March 29th, 1895 by an unsigned author. And this is while she was still alive. The article was titled, "Strange Story, a woman who thinks she'll die when her house is built," with the subheading, "A magnificent mansion on the Saratoga Road near San Jose, a maze of turrets and towers." So this is where the psychic is first mentioned, the idea that she has to continuously build to keep the spirits away, and the spirits specifically are ones killed by the Winchester rifle. This article also paints her as like a crazy witch, a crazy rich widower who thinks ghosts are out to kill her. And then after that article is printed, there's actually kind of some back and forth in the newspaper where like the townspeople actually come to her defense and refute these claims and say that it's not good, because if we keep trashing the wealthy people that come here, they won't want to more wealthy won't come, or like other wealthy people won't come, and or the wealthy will leave, because again, this was like, not a great economic time. And so Sarah Winchester provided a lot of work for the local community, because although she wasn't necessarily continuously building 24/7, she was doing a lot of construction, and that provided a lot of work. The reality is that she was an extremely wealthy woman who made around $30,000 a day in today's money, and she wanted to spend it all on building her house. The author of the book, Dickey, argues that she should actually be viewed as an architectural pioneer for her time, because she did all of the designing and architectural decisions herself. And there's actually letters that survive from Sarah that talk about giving her workers like winters off because of bad weather or other breaks. So that's not really true. And there's proof of that for not having her workers working all the time. And again, similar to the Salem Witch Trials, her legend depends on a cultural uneasiness about women living alone, withdrawn from society, and also an uneasiness about wealth and the way the super rich live among us. And perhaps the largest of all, an uneasiness about the gun that won the West and the violence white Americans carried out in the name of civilization. Dickey writes, "It's a compelling story, perhaps, because it's one in which Sarah Winchester is punished for these transgressions, driven mad by guilt, unable to join society, her money wasted and misspent. Winchester herself had little documented guilt about the role of the rifle in American history, but we've projected shame onto her nonetheless, as though we can quarantine such thoughts in the mind of someone long dead so the rest of us can go about our days unburdened, enjoying the California sun. And so I think that's a really interesting point. And I think that kind of goes to a way that we tell ghost stories, like he was saying, is like we can put the guilt onto these ghosts and say that's why they're unhappy and that's why they're haunting places because of all the stuff that we put on them, because we don't want to admit that those things still go on in our society. You know, there's still a lot of, I would say, guilt about guns in America. There's still some like hesitation about women not having kids or being unmarried, living alone, like that kind of thing. But when we put it onto the past, we can kind of say, oh, no, like that was then. Like we're totally perfect and fine now. So I thought that was a really interesting example of that. And then our last example of kind of the general population being uncomfortable with women being outside of their standard gender roles, we have spiritualism. We'll actually be covering a specific story on spiritualism and how it got its start in a couple weeks. But I thought it was still important to talk about in terms of how this part of history is remembered, if at all, and why or why not. Briefly, spiritualism began in the United States in the mid 1800s and was essentially a belief that the living and the dead could communicate with one another. And it really gained momentum during and after the Civil War because there was so much death and loss, and people were searching for ways to connect with their deceased loved ones. Another part of the appeal was the sense of community it gave to its believers. It was a way of bringing people together over shared grief or curiosity in an intimate and emotionally intense setting. Spiritualists saw little need for the men who traditionally controlled organized religion because anybody could access it. Spiritualism quickly became dominated by women. They were generally acknowledged to be the superior mediums, and many saw in spiritualism an antidote to the patriarchal misogyny of traditional religion. Many people viewed spiritualism with skepticism because it took a philosophy authored by men and transformed it into a woman's movement. Spiritualism tended to valorize traits that were elsewhere labeled as women's psychiatric diseases, including convulsions, incoherent babbling, open displays of sexuality, and other violations of Victorian decorum. Behavior that would have been diagnosed as nervous sensitivity and hysteria were exactly the kinds of traits that made for good mediums. And spiritualism even ties into the early suffrage movement. These meetings were heavily populated with mediums and trance speakers. In some places, it was difficult to find suffragists who weren't also spiritualists. It had given many women the practice and confidence in speaking to groups with authority, and eventually it led to more American women speaking for themselves. While spiritualism was only one of the many factors and social movements that drove women's suffrage, it was an important one. And not surprisingly then, as spiritualism became associated more and more with a rejection of patriarchal religion and traditional marriage even, women's rights, and other, quote, subversive agendas, the backlash was intense. The kind of modern take we have about spiritualism being this kind of like silly, fake, made-up thing stems in no small part from the misogyny with which it was attacked in the time that it was happening. And even though it's been kind of brushed off as an unimportant fad for grieving women in the mid to late 1800s, the reality of it is that spiritualism influenced political agitation, led to lasting reform. The 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution passed in 1920, which gave white women the right to vote. So now you have some fun trivia you can share at your Halloween party and tell people how talking to ghosts led to women getting the right to vote. All right, so switching gears a bit, another story I thought was interesting. It's not in the book, but I found this one looking up the United States' most haunted places. This is a very inventive way of using a ghost story, and it involves one of our founding fathers. And you may or may not have heard about it, depending on where you live. I had never heard about it. I'm on the West Coast. I feel like East Coast, upper, like the Northeast might be more likely to have heard about the story. But it is the story of the Jersey Devil, a creature with a goat or a horse head, depending on the person who's telling the story, a snake-like tail, hooved legs, and the wings of a bat. The legend goes that in the early 18th century, a woman by the name of Leeds gives birth to a devil-like creature that terrorized the surrounding area and has lived there ever since. This devil is said to have lived in an area called the Pine Barrens, which is an area of sandy, swampy forests, and it's close to a place called Leeds Point in New Jersey. And if you're ever wondering where the New Jersey Devils hockey team got their name, now you know. And although this sounds like a classic monster situation a la Sasquatch or the Loch Ness Monster, the Jersey Devils' origin story actually comes from religious and political schisms at the country's founding and a rivalry that none other than our old pal Benjamin Franklin, had with an almanac publisher. So the backstory is that a man named Daniel Leeds, a hardcore Quaker, back in the late 1600s, published the American Almanac, but it included astrology in it, so his fellow Quakers were like, oh, hell no, and turned on him and started calling him the Satan's Harbinger. He doubled down and then began writing anti-Quaker and scientific writings. When Daniel's son Titan took over the publication of the American Almanac, Benjamin Franklin used his Poor Richard's Almanac to help spread supernatural rumors about Titan. He joked about Titan's use of astrology and used the astrology to predict Titan's death. Titan responded after this, calling Benjamin Franklin a liar, but Franklin kind of keeps the bit going, and he responds by saying Titan's ghost must be riding since he's obviously dead. These various accusations about the family and the fact that they were also royalists during this, revolutionary time, and also not being traditional Christians, eventually morphed into a legend about the Leeds Devil, aka the Jersey Devil. And then in the early 1900s, some dude tried to revive the legend by claiming he actually caught the Jersey Devil alive, but it was sadly a kangaroo alive that was painted with stripes and they had attached fake wings to it. But according to the article I read, people are still spotting the Jersey Devil out in the Pine Barrens today. And for those who stuck around, this is where my cocktail comes in. This is called the Jersey Devil. It's kind of a take on a cocktail called the Jack Rose, but it's mostly apple brandy, lemon juice, and grenadine. It was kind of strong, so I filled it up with Sprite to taste because I have to work tomorrow. But it's pretty good. I would recommend it. And if you want to see me make this cocktail, check out the podcast TikTok, Yapping About History Pod, where I make the cocktail and talk about this story. Okay, so now let's pivot to an observation about American ghost stories, that they often exclude Indigenous and Black ghosts. A man named Jack Tremmell wrote about the Richmond slave trade, saying, "People are interested in battles, campaigns, and military heroics. They are not as interested in what those campaigns were fought over." Dickey adds his own thoughts on this, saying, "And while I assume that ghost stories are one way to tell those stories that people don't want to hear otherwise, as it happens, they are just as often used to reinforce those blind spots." So let's first talk about Indigenous ghosts. And this is in the framework of talking about like white or European stories. Indigenous cultures have like their own takes on the spirits and afterlife, things like that. We won't be talking about that necessarily in this episode, but we can in a future one if you'd like. So our country was inhabited long before Europeans arrived, so there is no place, no home that isn't sitting on top of someone else's former home. And Dickey argues that more often than not, we've chosen to deal with this fact through the language of ghosts. The ideas of haunted Indian land or Indian burial land really takes off in the 1970s, and it's incorporated into many horror movies and stories, such as the Amityville Horror and Stephen King's book Pet Sematary. But is it really surprising that these types of ghost stories started popping off in the 70s? What was going on in the US during that time that could have spurred all of these haunted Indian land stories? Well, in regards to King's Pet Sematary, which is set in Maine, in real life during that time, the state of Maine was involved in a massive legal battle against the different Wabanaki Confederacy tribes. These tribes had first sued Maine and the federal government in 1972 over lands which they were, by federal law, entitled to, which, by the way, amounted to 60% of the state of Maine. Long inhabited by non-Native Americans in Maine, the land in dispute was home to over 350,000 people who would have needed to be resettled had the tribes been successful. Once it became clear that the tribe's claims actually had merit, the government was like, oh, fuck. And so they scrambled to find a settlement that wouldn't involve the displacement of large amounts of non-Indigenous residents, ultimately awarding the three tribes more than $81 million. Much of that earmarked to purchase undeveloped land in Maine, along with other federal guarantees. Around this time, in 1980, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Sioux Nation of Indians, stating that the same 1868 treaty that gave them the rights to their land had been repeatedly violated by the U.S. government and white settlers. And because of this, they were entitled to compensation for the land taken from them. But in what I think is a very badass move, the Sioux Nation refused to accept the money because that meant that they'd forfeit all claims to the land, which, by the way, includes the Black Hills, which is where Mount Rushmore is. So, this is a big deal. What they want is their land back, and the land was taken illegally from them, and you have the Supreme Court agreeing. So, they were kind of like, we want the land because the treaty says that's what we are owed. We don't want your money. And to this day, they have still refused to accept that money, and it's estimated to be worth about $2 billion right now. It's just sitting in a U.S. Treasury account collecting interest. And in a similar vein, Indigenous activists actually occupied Alcatraz Island. Yes, the island in San Francisco Bay where the infamous prison is on, for about 18 months from 1969 to 1971. They were citing this 1868 treaty that the Sioux were using because it states that unused federal land should be returned to Native Americans. And while their movement didn't work, they were removed by federal marshals. It was a significant event that led to legal and social shifts for Native Americans. And if you actually go to Alcatraz for the tours, you can see some of the graffiti that was from this occupation. And with all this going on, it's not surprising that so many horror stories and movies made during this time revolved around haunted Native land, because it was very forefront in the U.S.'s current events and popular culture. Dickey writes, "The narratives of the haunted Indian burial ground hides a certain anxiety about the land on which Americans, specifically white middle-class Americans, live. Embedded in the idea of home ownership, the holy grail of American middle-class life, is the idea that we don't, in fact, own the land we've just bought. Time and time again in these stories, perfectly average, innocent American families are confronted by ghosts who have persevered for centuries, who remain vengeful for the damage done. Facing these ghosts and expelling them in many of these horror stories becomes a means of refighting the Indian wars of past centuries." And I personally feel the fact that there's not many stories about ghosts actually being Native people, because I feel like these horror stories are kind of like crazy hauntings and like poltergeists and stuff happen because of the land, but the creatures and the ghosts themselves are not actually Native people, if that makes sense. I find that kind of interesting because it further emphasizes this idea that we have in mainstream white American ideology of Native peoples being like extinct or something of the past, and that they aren't still around, which, hello, they still are. So I think that's a very interesting kind of play on this particular type of ghost story. The land is still here, but they are not, even in our ghost stories. And that's, I feel like, a reflection of how we tell or don't tell Native people's history. And then another often missing element in common American ghost stories are Black people or Black ghosts. Dickey uses the example of the LaLaurie Mansion in Louisiana. This is a very famous story, but if you don't know, It's basically the LaLaurie family has a mansion in Louisiana during the 1800s, during antebellum times, so during slavery. They own slaves, and the wife is particularly like evil and does all these really awful, horrible things to her enslaved people. It like tortures them. I won't go into specifics, but it's pretty gruesome. There's a fire one day at the mansion, and people are trying to go and help get everyone out, including the enslaved people. And the LaLauries are like, no, 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 like don't get the slaves, don't. But someone finally breaks in and rescues the enslaved people, and they see the condition that they're in and they're horrified. This gets out. The LaLauries immediately flee the scene. And this is kind of used as an example of how awful slavery is and slave owners are. But it kind of morphs. So at first, that's kind of how it's seen. It's like used to highlight the cruelty of slave owners and the evilness of slavery. But after a while, it kind of reverses course and kind of flip-flops the narrative, and kind of how we're talking about where we put all of our like guilt and shame onto these ghosts. The view of at the time kind of turns where like they become the exception to the otherwise genteel and proper forms of enslavement that everyone else is doing. It was just them, that one single couple. They were the only ones doing slavery, you know, quote unquote, wrong. We're all doing it right. So it was kind of used as this way to off put any shame and guilt people had from owning human beings and putting it onto them. Because it's like, well, I'm not being disgusting and evil like they are, so I must be a good person. So kind of that was happening at the time. And of course, now this is like a super haunted place. But again, it's kind of that, even I would say today, I haven't been there, so I haven't had any personal ghost tours, so I can't speak to what they talk about, but I can't help but feel that's still kind of the idea of that story. It's like, look how evil these people were. But you know, that was just the exception to the rule. Dickey also talks about this town called Chaco, Virginia, that is known for being like super haunted because there's all these like, you know, mass tragedies of throughout the years. But weirdly, slavery is not ever brought up. Even in a book called Haunted Richmond, The Shadows of Chaco by Scott and Sandy Bergman, they do not mention slavery at all. Which is weird because the area was heavily involved in the slave trade, with one of the largest slave markets in the US being located there. And it's known for a particularly evil place called the Devil's Half Acre, where a slave trader named Lumpkin kept his slaves for trading, breeding, and for imprisoning. He was known to be fond of torturing and being violent towards his enslaved people, and yes, he had a specific area for breeding human beings. This is an especially evil and twisted aspect of an already evil and twisted thing that is not, I feel like, talked about. But enslavers would forcefully breed their enslaved human beings, and some ran their entire businesses just off breeding. So they, instead of having like a plantation with tobacco or cotton, people would have plantations for breeding human beings. Especially when the transatlantic slave trade was banned, they turned to breeding these human beings to make sure they had enough slaves. But today, not much of this area is left. A lot of it is now where a freeway and university parking lot are located. But recent archaeological digs did find human remains, and there's a little space denoting where this Devil's Half Acre was and what it used to be. So yeah, I'd say it's pretty interesting that none of this is included in the local ghost and haunted stories. And this kind of goes back to some of our earlier questions. Whose stories get told? Why don't we know these stories? Why are we still kind of hiding from our most troubling stories from our past? There's actually a book on the Devil's Half Acre that I kind of want to talk about in a future episode. In a similar note, do you know the origins of the Ku Klux Klan? I didn't really know this, so I thought this was pretty interesting. It was started by Confederate Army vets who wanted to, quote, play pranks and, quote, cause mischief. And they named themselves the Ku Klux Klan, which was kind of like a gibberish play on a Greek word that doesn't really make any sense. And they began harassing, beating, torturing, and killing newly freed Black people right after the Civil War, and also any Northerners who came down to try to help them. Some of their OG pranks would be dressing up as Confederate ghosts with white sheets over them. So this is actually where their future uniforms come into play, but these original KKK members were just throwing on white sheets and pretending to be ghosts. And they would go into black people's homes and, pretending to be ghosts, tell them that they needed to like stay in line or get out of town, or the ghosts would come and kill them or haunt them. Now, I don't think they were actually fooling anyone, but their threats were obviously real and were taken seriously, and it had long-lasting psychological effects. And of course, we see iterations of the KKK throughout time, but this is kind of their origin story, is they were dressing up as ghosts. However, this is not the first time that white people would use ghosts as a means of social control, especially over black people. Slave owners employed so-called patrollers, which were usually poor white people, who would patrol the countryside at night. And they would regularly use ghost stories, among other tactics, to help keep enslaved people from escaping. A man in a white sheet on horseback, riding ominously through the forest, could help substantiate rumors that the forest was haunted and that those who valued their lives best avoid it. So, don't run away. So yeah, I just thought that was kind of interesting. I didn't realize that the KKK was originally, the whole point of the white sheet was that they were pretending to be ghosts. And then we'll round out our discussion with another very interesting topic that I wasn't aware of, and that is ghosts in court cases. So the first story is about ghost testimony being used to convict someone. There's a historical marker on the side of the interstate in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, that states, quote, "Interred in nearby cemetery is Zona Hester Shue. Her death in 1897 was presumed natural until her spirit appeared to her mother to describe how she was killed by her husband, Edward. Autopsy on the exhumed body verified the apparition's account. Edward, found guilty of murder, was sentenced to the state prison. Only known case in which testimony from ghost helped convict a murderer," end quote. So Zona's mother, Mary Jane Hester, claimed that she was visited by her daughter's ghost after it was said that she had died of natural causes. Mary claimed that Zona's ghost had told her where to find blood in a cellar. When Mary went to go look, she did find blood. And then Zona's ghost kept visiting her for about a week. And at the last visit, Zona's ghost told Mary that her neck had been squeezed off at the first joint. And Mary couldn't handle all these hauntings and her belief that her daughter had been murdered. So she finally goes to the county prosecutor. And they believe her, or maybe they kind of suspected the husband because he had been acting kind of weird. But either way, they exhume Zona's body and they open an inquest about a month after her death. The autopsy revealed that she did have a broken neck and other bruising that would be consistent with a fall or some sort of accident. Mary repeats all her stories about being haunted under oath, and Zona's husband, Edward, is found guilty of her murder. But given the weird circumstances surrounding the case, he was not given the death penalty, but instead was given a life sentence in prison. But what I think is the most interesting part of this ghost story is a modern theory of what actually happened from author Katie Letcher Lyle. She notes that in the January 28, 1897 edition of the Greenbrier Independent, news of Zona Hester Shue's death was covered on page 3, but on page 1, there was a curious story out of Australia. Quote, "One of the most famous murder cases in Australia," it read, "was discovered by the ghost of a murdered man sitting on the rail of a dam," which is Australian for a horse pond, "into which his body had been thrown. Numberless people saw it, and the crime was duly brought home." The item continues, "Years after, a dying man making a confession said that he invented the ghost. He had actually witnessed the crime, but was threatened with death if he divulged it as he wanted to. And the only way that he saw out of the impasse was to affect to see the ghost where the body would have been found. As soon as he started the story, such is the power of nervousness that numerous other people began to see it, until its fame reached such dimensions that a search was made and the body found and the murderers brought to justice." Mary Jane Hester was no idiot, nor was she hysterical. She probably had strong suspicions that Edward had killed her daughter and that the local officials whatever their own beliefs might have been, weren't doing anything about it. The Australian ghost story inspired her, according to Lyle, to concoct her own vision of justice, which she then used as leverage to spur the authorities back into action. I mean, this theory totally makes sense. And what a smart woman who probably knew her daughter's husband was a piece of shit. And maybe there was, maybe previous occasions of domestic violence or something that Mary had seen. And to be fair, Zona was Edward's third wife. His first wife divorced him, in the late 1800s, which was rare for this time. And some claimed that she feared for her life, and that's why they got divorced. His second wife died less than a year into their marriage, with the only recorded description being that she had died, quote, very suddenly at her home, which I feel like sounds pretty similar to what happened to Zona. He had also been to prison previously for horse thievery. Whether or not Mary or Zona knew any of this, it probably didn't take too long after knowing him that he wasn't really a great person. But I thought that was a really interesting story where the mom probably got this idea of the ghost story from reading the paper in the edition that was announcing her daughter's death. Then we have Strombosky versus Ackley. So this dude named Jeffrey Stambosky buys a home from Helen Ackley in 1989 in Nyack, New York. Helen was claiming that her house was haunted for almost a decade before selling it to Jeffrey. She would let local walking tours look around the house, and it was even featured in Reader's Digest. However, Jeffrey wasn't aware of the house's lore until after he bought it. He claimed that ghosts lowered the value of the house, and he sued Helen for not telling him about the house's haunted past. A lower court dismissed his claim under the principle of caveat emptor, meaning it was basically his responsibility to do his due diligence as the buyer of the home. But he appealed, and in a New York State appellate opinion, Justice Israel Rubin finally agreed with him. Justice Rubin avoided the question of determining if the house was actually haunted, but instead basically said if Helen was advertising her house as haunted, then it was, and it's unreasonable to assume that all potential homeowners are going to check the house for paranormal activity. And Rubin's opinion is full of ghost puns, and he even throws in who you gonna call. You can tell that he had a lot of fun with it. But, so that's the first case where, you have to, if you're going to be going around saying your house is haunted, you have to tell the person that's going to buy it. And finally, we have a case that made it all the way to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Almost 20 years after Jeffrey's case, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court would take on many of the same issues, though they would reach a significantly different outcome. In 2008, Janet Milliken sued the previous owners of her home in Thornton, Pennsylvania. The home had been the scene of a gruesome murder-suicide. It was subsequently bought cheaply at auction by Kathleen and Joseph Jonico, who renovated it and then resold it to Milliken. A classic house flip. She then sued Kathleen and Joseph, claiming that they had purposefully withheld information that materially affected the value of the house. And so, it winds its way through the court system and ends up at the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. But this time, the court sides with the sellers, Kathleen and Joseph. The court wrote, quote, "One cannot quantify the psychological impact of different genres of murder or suicide," end quote. Psychological stigma, no matter its subjective effect on some, presented the court with such a slippery slope of possibilities that there was no way for them to contemplate it as a material defect. In this case, they said it was on the buyer to look into these things. Basically, it's a buyer beware type of situation. And this is interesting to note because California has a law that states home sellers must disclose any deaths that take place in the house within the past 3 years. This book was written in 2016, so I'm not sure if maybe some of those laws have changed since then, like in Pennsylvania. some final words to wrap it up. Ghost stories do so much more than creeping us out and making us sleep with the light on. As Dickey writes, they reveal the contours of our anxieties, the nature of our collective fears and desires, the things we can't talk about in any other way. The past we're most afraid to speak aloud of in the bright light of day is the same past that tends to linger in the ghost stories we whisper in the dark. Ghost stories also connect us to what we thought was lost. They give us hope for a life beyond death, and because of this, help us to cope with loss and grief. Ghost stories are also about how we face or fail to face the past, how we process information, how we narrate our past, and how we make sense of the gaps in that history. And that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this dive into American ghost stories and their connections to history and what they tell us about our society. You can follow the pod on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, all at Yappin' About History Pod. And we'll see you next week. Bye!